It's The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from Istanbul, Borzu Dargai, international correspondent for The Independent. How are you, sir?
Good. Great to talk to you. I can't see you, but I hope you can see me.
We can see you fine, thanks to the magic of Skype. From Brussels, Dave Clark, news editor at the French news agency AFP. How are you?
I'm good. I don't need to see you. I can hear you well enough.
Well, you're also going to be hearing Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. How are things?
Oh, I have that special pleasure of a face-to-face meeting this Friday.
All right. But face-to-face meeting with George Kazolius. George Kazolius, freelance journalist. How you been?
I'm doing fine.
All right. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter. Hashtag World This Week. With U.S.-Russia relations at a post-Cold War low, the bar for success was also low on Lake Geneva shoreline. Before shaking hands with Vladimir Putin, Joe Biden had spent a week rallying the troops at the G7 summit, at the NATO summit, at the EU-US summit. No hitting reset buttons in Geneva or staring into souls. Even when it was over, the pair managed expectations, for instance, like when the Russian president was asked if they were happy.
Leo Tolstoy once said, "There is no happiness in life. There are only distant flashes of it. Appreciate it." I think in this situation we can't trust each other like family, but I think we have seen distant flashes of it.
Borzu Dargai, you hear that? There is no happiness in life.
It's, the philosophical outlook of an old KGB operative, rather dark. Look, they can talk nice all they want, Putin and Biden, but the bottom line is that there are hard interests which clash between the United States and its allies and Russia and its clients. And, there's no wiggle room around some of those. Let's take one example. They want Russia to allow humanitarian aid to get into parts of Syria that are under the control of rebel factions opposed to Bashar al-Assad. Russia has refused this, and there's a good reason why it's refused this, because starving those regions and gaining a victory for Bashar al-Assad is a major goal for Vladimir Putin, and they're not going to buckle to the U.S. demands just because of any humanitarian concerns.
But did they do a better job this time of, again, managing those expectations?
But what does that mean, and what does it matter? The point is that they didn't make any progress, and they probably won't make any progress on improving the lives of Syrians, Ukrainians, and those others that are caught in the sort of crossfire of the conflicts and ongoing tensions between the U.S. and Russia. So they manage. It sounds like something out of a foreign policy theory magazine. It doesn't really translate to anything on the ground.
Dave Clark, you had Joe Biden come your way. What with those two summits that took place in Brussels at the start of the week? He kept repeating the mantra that America's back. What's your takeaway from that visit?
Well, obviously he didn't update his talking points on a daily basis, and there were a lot of summits for him to get through. But in a way, more important than his meeting with Putin was his meeting with the European allies and with NATO. I'm not just saying that because I'm a Brussels correspondent and we were jealous of all the coverage that the Geneva meeting got, although there's probably a bit of that. But he too seemed a bit frustrated that all the questions he got about what little came out of the Putin meeting. And I suspect Putin himself was probably more interested to see that Biden sees closer to seeing eye to eye with NATO than his predecessor did. And I suspect that's more of a message that Vladimir Putin will take home to Moscow with him, that he's not going to be able to play this American president off against his European allies, and that the Western alliance is more united once again, although I think that does also paper over some very real cracks. There's obviously a lot of relief here that the talking points have returned to as they are as usual, but The European Union meeting, for example, was dominated by trade disputes. And they managed to say that they would delay the next round of punitive tariffs in the Airbus-Boeing dispute for 5 years. But even that was portrayed as in different ways by the two sets of allies. The European Union, and they didn't hold a joint press conference, but the European Union leaders, Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, were very keen to talk about that in the context of transatlantic trade. But for President Biden, this was an opportunity to take a pause from fighting with Europe in order to better concentrate on China, something that he does not have as much support over here in Europe as you might think.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second and go back to Geneva for a moment. According to the White House, Biden did respect protocol by offering to Vladimir Putin gifts, a sculpture of an American bison and his signature Ray-Ban aviation sunglasses. But it wasn't all charm, like when Biden warned of devastating consequences if Alexei Navalny died in prison, or when the U.S. president seemed to be half coercing, half cajoling on where Russia's interests lie.
You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China's moving ahead, hell-bent on election, as they say, seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world, the largest, and the most powerful military in the world. You're in a situation where your economy is struggling. You need to move it in a more aggressive way in terms of growing it. And I don't think he's looking for a Cold War with the United States.
So beneath the niceties, George Kazolius, there you have Joe Biden saying to Vladimir Putin, hey, you've got your economic problems, and would you rather have a bigger problem with us or with the Chinese?
Well, I think that Biden underestimates the influence he can have on Putin. I don't think Putin really cares. I mean, he's still got massive support in Russia, and he's predictable. He's going to do whatever it takes to defend Russian interests against encroachment or any other sort of threat.
But on the issue of China, on this idea of where Russia's interests lie,
I don't see a conflict between Russia and China. I mean, China's building the Silk Road Railroad. There's pipelines going back to China from the oil fields in the south. Where's Russia's interest in joining a conflict that the Americans are in a race against time with against the Chinese? They have no interest in getting involved in that.
Lilo Jacinto?
Well, I think what his statement, what Biden's statement actually reflects is a sort of frustration in, as Borzu calls it, the foreign policy theory manuals of Washington, of the lack of vision that Washington sees in Moscow. I mean, Putin's game has basically been playing a spoiler. I don't think that is going to change. That seems to be the end game in all this. But, Biden is right. Russia and China have a joint border. And the general move is to stop Russia and China being a sort of nexus that the rest of the international community, particularly countries along the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, sort of move away from the Western European nexus. But Putin is extremely comfortable in this role and of being the spoiler. But there was some developments, at least, of the Biden-Putin meeting. The very bare minimum, not reset, but at least restarting basic diplomatic moves, having ambassadors in the two countries, talking about restarting disarmament programs. The New START program is going to terminate in 2026, and this is an area where the two countries have managed to get into negotiations even through the thick of the Cold War. So yes, Biden is pointing to Putin that your economy isn't doing so well. Not sure Putin, the KGB man, is particularly listening to Biden, and I think those Ray-Ban glasses for a former FSB guy is not a bad gift.
Okay, especially when they're custom made. Borzu Dargahi, you mentioned earlier how Biden prodded Putin on the issue of humanitarian aid for Syria. In the same breath, he talked about it being in Russia's interest to help push for the Iranians to return to the bargaining table and that UN deal that Donald Trump walked away from. Again, you heard what George Kazolis had to say about Putin's interests when it came to China. What are Putin's interests when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, I mean, Russia is actively involved and playing, perhaps a uniquely constructive role in terms of bringing the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, back online. Russia, China, they don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons either, and so they're into this non-proliferation deal. But aside from that, I don't think that, I think that if you look at Putin's interests, even if you look at China's interests, they like Iran being kind of sticking its stick occasionally in the face of the United States. They like the fact that there's this very loud, vociferous anti-American voice creating problems for the United States in the Middle East and the Gulf. The militias that the U.S. is very concerned about, these are militias that are mostly creating problems for U.S. allies in the Middle East. And so, to them, it distracts the United States. It bogs them down and draws them further in the Middle East. Look, I mean, we're talking about raw power here, and they don't, Russia and China, Russia will ditch the United States and betray the United States way before it will go against China, which it sees as a model that it can deal with. And as a nation that is not a threat to its political system. Whereas any success story in Europe, any success story in Eastern Europe, any success story even in the autocratic Middle East is considered a threat to the Russian autocratic model. So I think that we shouldn't be naive here in talking about what this rivalry between Russia and the United States is all about.
If it's about raw power, and again, we heard the terms coached, Lila Jacinto, about how this was Joe Biden when he was in Brussels and when he was in Geneva, making about democracies versus authoritarian states. Nonetheless, you get the sense that part of the problem might be, and this is what some analysts wonder, if he becomes a one-term president, you have Donald Trump or a Donald Trump-like figure that returns, that the problem of democracy versus authoritarian states, well, it could be a domestic issue in the U.S., really.
No, absolutely. And you saw that, of course, in his meetings with EU leaders. Yes, it was good to have sanity back into the White House, but there is definitely, in the 4 years of Trump, EU leaders have come to the conclusion that they've got to make their own arrangements because the Democrats, the internal picture in the U.S. is still dysfunctional. America is back. But it's not the same world that it was 4 years ago, and with Russia and Iran, there's also Afghanistan that the two countries are going to have to work with because U.S. troops are pulling out, and Afghanistan is very much in Russia's backyard. So this push for democracy, it's a good talk, but the fact is that Russia and China still have a sort of a model that is appealing to large parts of the non-Western world.
And some inside the Western world. Although, Dave Clark, we heard those that do business like with China, like Hungary, for instance, basically keep a low profile when Joe Biden was in Brussels.
They did, but those who do business with Russia did less so. Look, we talk about an alliance of democracies, but we're also an alliance of developed economies. The continent will be moving to all-electric power as part of its move to a lower carbon economy. And Germany is going to import an awful lot of natural gas. It's going to import that natural gas from Russia, and it has no interest in disturbing that flow. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline will be completed almost certainly, and the Washington has failed in its attempts to slow that. It just shows that there's despite the happy mood music that we got with Biden's visit, in some extent Europe has moved on already, and to some extent the interests were not 100% aligned all along. On the issue of natural gas, I remember there were officials in the previous Obama administration and then in the Trump administration always coming over to Brussels trying to sell American natural gas, but it's so much more expensive. You'd have to build new ports for the massive ships and so forth. The pipelines will be easier. It's an amoral game.
Not to mention, it's also the American gas comes from fracking, and the Germans are very, very hostile to fracking. And also, the Germans and the French, they do business in China too.
Right.
Why would they want to jump on?
There's a joint press conference taking place this Friday evening between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. Merkel's saying we should maintain dialogue with Russia.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Russia is part of Europe, right? And over the past 4 years, I think Europeans have learned a bit, at least the Europeans west of the former Warsaw Pact have learned that, maybe they should work harder in counting on themselves because the United States is not really that dependable.
Dave Clark?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, if Joe Biden was 20 years younger and had 20 more points in the polls, they might be more convinced that he'll still be around in 4 years' time. But that wouldn't mean that that people like Emmanuel Macron wouldn't still be pushing for a more European strategic autonomy.
All right, one final point on all of this. Your thoughts, Borzo Daragahi, on the diverging attitudes inside of Europe when it comes not just on this issue of whether to do trade with Russia, but as Lila Jacinto mentioned, over what NATO's role is to be going forward, particularly with that drawdown in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, that is so many questions in one question. I don't know how I would begin to answer that. So I'll just take one aspect of that. The issue of Afghanistan is a very, very, very big one, and let's look at what's going to happen in Afghanistan. The Taliban is going to surge, as it already is. It's going to take over a lot of the country. That's going to cause a massive flow of refugees. It's actually, I live in Istanbul. There's already, the numbers of arrivals from Afghanistan are growing exponentially in recent months. And so they're not growing gradually. They're jumping, doubling every few months. So you're going to have massive flows of refugees here. They all want to go to Europe, and that's good for Russia. They like that. They like the destabilization of European democracies and the rise of the far right because of the arrival of these Muslim refugees from Afghanistan and other countries. So they're not going to want to participate in that. And so I think you're going to get this very, very ugly dynamic coming in the next year with regard to the French elections and other elections and another fresh flow of refugees, this time from Afghanistan.
When we come back in The World This Week, we're going to take a look at the election that's taking place this Friday in Iran. Stay with us. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. With us from Istanbul, Borzo Daragahi, international correspondent for The Independent. From Brussels, Dave Clark, news editor at the French news agency AFP. Lila Jacinto, senior editor at France24.com. And freelance reporter George Kozolius is with us as well. Polls will be closing later on in Iran. They can vote till midnight, perhaps even longer. The presidential election featuring a hardliner as heavy favorite. The rest of the field whittled down to just 3 challengers. The former Judiciary Chief Ibrahim Raisi, who's already, by the way, under U.S. sanctions, reportedly the candidate backed by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. The biggest question is, will it be the biggest abstention rate since the 1979 revolution?
It's like a video game. They control us. Maybe just a main player change, okay? One day Mr. Rouhani, one day Mr. Raisi, one day Mr. Ahmadinejad. They just change, okay? We are just players here. They are coach.
If people don't vote, nothing will happen. I hope everyone will participate in this election so that the enemy won't be happy.
Borzu Dargahi, does it matter, this election?
I think it does. It's hard to tell what it will mean, but I think that in this sense it will matter. Ibrahim Raisi is he's a hardliner and an extremist, a right-wing radical, part of the regime's most extreme faction, and he will be president, and he will be doing the bidding of the Revolutionary Guard and the supreme leader, and that will make things tougher for other countries that want to make deals with Iran. Even if let's say the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, is resurrected, it's going to make it a lot tougher to do business with this regime, with this face, the guy who is allegedly behind one of the worst crimes in the Islamic Republic, the mass execution of thousands of prisoners in Evin prison in 1988. He was one of the people who sat on the sort of star chamber that sentenced these people to death.
It was called the Death Commission.
This is a guy who is it was literally called the Death Commission. And what's interesting is that he continues to defend it. There are some people in the regime who, when they speak about this incident, they say, well, really bad things happened in the first years after the revolution. This guy, he defends it publicly, repeatedly. He's toned it down a bit, is trying to reinvent himself as somewhat moderate to increase his numbers for the election. But, no one is really fooled by this. And, what I dread is what comes next for ordinary Iranians. Every time they've said, well, it can't get any worse, it does.
Leila Jacinto?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, the Guardian Council that approves candidates, rejected so many candidates, including Ahmadinejad and Rafsanjani, pretty moderate characters. So it seems to me that the establishment is really taking no chances. They absolutely want the country in conservative hands. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is 82, I think. This is a 4-year term. Should he die, then we're going to come up with a new supreme leader. And from past experience, Khamenei was the president in the 80s and then became the supreme leader. So, is there a positioning of Ibrahim Raisi, this extremely hardline cleric and judicial chief, as Borzu painted out? Are we looking at the next supreme leader? And I couldn't agree more with Borzu. These are very hard times for Iranians.
Or it's just, again, a bargaining posture, what with the question being whether or not Iran wants to go back to the table when it comes to nuclear talks, the nuclear deal that Donald Trump walked away from. Now, there is in the race one former central bank governor, Abdel Nasser Hemati, portrayed as the only moderate.
Our country's problem must be seriously addressed. We need to cooperate with the world. No country in the world has reached proper economic growth and development without engaging in serious cooperation with the world.
Do you get the sense, George Kazolis, that no matter who wins, they're going to want to go back to the nuclear talks?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, sure. But I'm going to take it from another angle. What's been said about Iran is all true. But let's take it from another angle. If you want Iran to change, back off. What country? I mean, Iranians are no less patriotic and no less in love with their country than Americans or Frenchmen. If they're being threatened every day with annihilation, if there are bombs and sabotage going off and leaders are being assassinated, and it's very hard to do a reform movement. If France were under attack, I wouldn't be out in the streets of Paris protesting Macron's pension reform. I'd be defending my country. So if we want a real change, because it's clear Iranians want to change. It's clear. We've seen it. And Iranians have been getting killed and put in prison for wanting change. And it's clear that that Raisi and Khamenei and the others, they're scared. They know that they're in a position of weakness. And as you just pointed out with the voter turnout, that's even a further proof that they are in difficulty. In Ahmadinejad also called to boycott these elections. So if we really want to help the Iranians improve their country, I'm not saying they want to be Americans. Why would they want to be Americans? But they do want change, and that's clear. Then we have to back off and give them the prosperity and opportunity to participate in the global community.
Backing off, Dave Clark, is what the Obama administration did back in 2009 when there were post-election protests, people chanting, "Where's my vote?" Your thoughts? You agree with George Cazolius?
It depends whether, this sounds enormously cruel, whether you want to leave aside the suffering of the Iranians and develop your own relations with the regime in place. It kind of makes sense for the outside world to want the hardest face of the regime to be clearly the figurehead in the power. There'd be very little point doing a renewed JCPOA with a moderate figure who'd been placed there as a figurehead to seem plausible to us. There were 600 candidates for these elections. All but 9 were ruled out before it even started. 3 dropped out before polling day. It's not a democratic event at all. If we're dealing with Iran, we're dealing with power structure, which, as you mentioned, or one of my fellow guests mentioned, is dominated by elements from the Revolutionary Guard or from the and from the Supreme Leader's faction. What's interesting to me in the turnout figure that you cited is that FARS feels itself free to report such a low turnout figure. And that'll be the number that people will be looking at. That's effectively a referendum on the system itself. And it's also telling to me that they don't feel like they can just lie about it. There are other totalitarian regimes around the world that would just simply announce a 99% turnout and 96% for the ruling party candidate. So, in this sense, there are clearly other political units at work within Iran. I don't want to use moderates and extremists. I don't think any of them would be very welcome in our Western liberal democracies. But there are people who are closer to the aspirations of the Iranian people who and movements who may see the value in collaborating with outside powers, and people who are wedded to this brutal dictatorship. And there must be some politics at play. It's not a desert. Otherwise, they wouldn't feel the need to call, as the Supreme Leader did, for more turnout. And they would simply lie about it.
Borzu Dargai, all this in the nation that invented chess. Is it true? Do you agree with Dave Clark that you can't just stuff the ballot in Iran?
I think that they are over the ballot. I think that in an age where, Lukashenko and the Republican Party of the United States and other autocrats and hybrid democratic, quote unquote, systems are, completely rigged and faked and so on, they just don't care anymore. And I don't think that they're that afraid, because if they were, so afraid, they wouldn't have shorn off and scuttled any attempt at popular legitimacy so easily. I think that they just went through a really harsh period. They had nationwide protests in 2017, 2018, another round of protests in 2019. They suffered through Trump's sanctions, and they managed to kind of suffer through the worst outbreak of coronavirus in the Middle East. And I think they're feeling pretty confident. And so that's why I think they're basically, this democracy thing, maybe it's a little overrated. Who cares if we get low turnout? Who cares if there's no popular mandate for whoever is going to be president? We have the truncheon. We have emulations of surveillance systems that we have borrowed from other Western countries. We have cameras everywhere now. We can track people's cell phones. We can listen in on their phone calls. So we have the technology, we have the power, we have the experience to crush any dissent, and we don't really need to worry about getting a large number of people to buy into the regime.
All right, we'll see what that final turnout is. In other stories we're following, it was the week when Zambia's first president, Kenneth Kaunda, passed away at the age of 97, and the one where another mainstay of African politics made his grand return. Supporters of Ivory Coast's former president Laurent Gbagbo going wild in the streets of Abidjan upon his return from Brussels. It's been 10 years since his refusal to concede an election to current President Alassane Ouattara, the rekindling then of a civil war, and ultimately his extradition to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, where the case was recently dropped for good.
I'm happy being back in the Ivory Coast and in Africa. Because I know that I'm from the Ivory Coast, and in prison I knew that I belonged to Africa. All of Africa. All of Africa supported me, as did my people.
Dave Clark, as a former Lagos correspondent, let me ask you about this, because everybody projects, and Laurent Gbagbo means different things to different people. There's a grain of truth in what he says, that he belongs to Africa.
Oh, he belongs to the world. Laurent Gbagbo lost an election, tried to cling on to power, stirred up his supporters, and was eventually forced from office, rather like the last president of the United States. As we mentioned in the last story about Iran, these are recurring themes in politics in recent decades, and by the standards of his continent certainly, but also many other places around the world, his crimes were not so great. They weren't able to pin anything international on him when he was in The Hague. And if Ivory Coast is ever to have a stable electoral system, at some point there'll have to be an election in which there are 2 or 3 candidates with plausible chances of success, followed by a concession. So why not bring back the old guy and let him have another run at it? And he's not been convicted of anything, again, rather like Donald Trump. He has. He was convicted of defrauding the Central Bank of West Africa, but I understand he may be pardoned on that. And that will enable him to retake his place. He does have a constituency. We saw the crowds in your footage. It maybe wasn't as big a set of crowds as you might have hoped for, I suspect. But the current president would have, in a way, less legitimacy if he was to stand for office and didn't allow all of his rivals to stand against him.
Yeah, we did see in the last election, Lila Jacinto, that one of Alassane Ouattara's main rivals, there were charges brought against him. Guillaume Soro was forced into exile. The case of Laurent Gbagbo, he's had so many lives. He was this icon of the fight for multi-party democracy when you had single parties running most African countries in the late 80s and early 90s. Then he becomes president under...
he was an opponent of Houphouët.
He was an opponent of Houphouët. He was an ally of Ouattara. Then he became an opponent of Ouattara. He's had a civil war. He lost that election. He's now been vindicated cleared at least by the court. At 76, can you reinvent yourself?
Well, Africa, unfortunately, seems to be a continent of old men, and old men who do not give up bar. And Gbagbo's return is really just a deal between 3 old men, Alassane Ouattara, Bedi, and Gbagbo himself. As you mentioned,
he's the youngest of the 3.
Indeed, indeed. And the young leader that is really
younger than Joe Biden.
And the young leader who is really a threat to all 3 of them is outside the country, is facing all sorts of allegations and charges, and I'm absolutely, who was it? Dave talked about, maybe the crowds weren't as big as imagined. I got that feeling too. Yes, certainly, the atmosphere was electric, but I get a sense that average Ivorians who are overwhelmingly young really want to see real change and would like to see reconciliation. And I'm not sure that the underlying causes and the underlying factors that need to be addressed to bring about this reconciliation are being dealt with. These are the same old men making the same old deals, jumping in one bed and getting into another bed.
Yeah, the reconciliation process never really worked, George Cazolis.
No, and actually there was
It was a commission, but it...
Yeah, in 2018, Ouattara pardoned civilian political prisoners from that period, which he took advantage of to pardon the commanders of his militias that committed atrocities. So there's been no justice. And I sort of disagree with you. I got a completely different sense from what happened yesterday. I got the sense that, well, nothing has changed in 10 years. Those same divisions are still there.
Even though Ivory Coast has been through in that decade growth, 6% growth most years.
But that growth, we're still at 40% under the poverty line. We see that wealth is not going to people.
Sure, it's in Abidjan.
And what about the illiteracy rate is still 50% and worse for women. So I mean, there's been no progress and no reconciliation. 25% of the population of the Ivory Coast are migrants from Muslim Mali and Burkina Faso. You've got a jihadi insurgency creeping down from the north. I mean, the Côte d'Ivoire I don't see as stable at all. I don't see anything has changed in the past 10 years. I feel I'm back in 2010.
All right. Before we go, while a new COVID strain forces Britain to push back the easing of lockdown, France has dropped in cases better than expected. Hence, we've had an early lifting of mandatory face masks in public. Part of it's about a vaccination campaign that is running ahead of schedule here, but it's showing signs of tapering. So what do? Well, the Netherlands taking citizens by the heartstrings by offering new season Dutch pickled herring. The U.S. state of Maine gives out fishing and hunting licenses if you get a jab. Indonesia going one better. A new door-to-door vaccination drive in the Sipanas district of West Java, offering, you guessed it, a chicken. One chicken, one jab. While in the Mae Cham district of Thailand's northern Chiang Mai province, 65-year-old Inkam Tongkam became one of the weekly winners of the lucky draw, offering a beauty of a 1-year-old female cow.
I feel very grateful and very happy to win one of the cows. And it's a big one. I will raise it and let it breed more cattle.
Borzu Dargahi, what is your religion when it comes to incentives to get vaccinated?
I think it's an awesome idea. You didn't mention, I thought you would, Washington State's offer of a free marijuana
I was leaving that
joint
for you.
If you, I just think that, I think it's great. And you've got these programs in certain British municipalities where they offer beers and so on. I think it's fantastic. And I think it also bolsters, in some way, all those stories you tell, they bolster a sense of community in getting us out of this very dark period. I'm very pro bribery in terms of getting people to get their vaccination.
Well, we've had healthcare professionals, Lila Jacinto, who don't feel that way, who say, wait a minute, this is a responsibility we have to get vaccinated against things like polio and hepatitis and now COVID.
Oh, they should
Well, those are healthcare experts, and they should keep their expertise to epidemiology and public health. I want a camembert or a bottle of wine, some good Burgundy for my jab.
Cow.
Cow, there you go. No, I just wonder what's wrong with people. I mean, in Europe, in the United States, we have other means of convincing people they should get a jab. For example, you don't go to a concert, or you're not allowed into a restaurant, or whatever. We have this passport.
So let me ask you, the French health minister is considering measures against those who work in retirement homes because public health workers, 85% of them are vaccinated. Don't know why not the other 15 yet, but anyway. in the retirement homes, like 55%. He's wondering if he should make it mandatory. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that you are putting people in danger. You're putting their lives in danger if they're elderly and susceptible to complications with this disease. If you are not vaccinated, you shouldn't be around them. I think there are measures to be taken. There are obligatory vaccines, as you just said. And this should be one of them if you want to be in public with people.
Dave Clark, you've got to get yourself posted back to Paris because there is a cafe near Montmartre it's a bar called Le Fondamental. If you show your vaccination certificate, they will give you a free beer. What do you think of that?
French beer?
Well, I think that's great, but I live in Brussels where I have my vaccination certificate and I have Belgian beer. So for me, the big bonus of having my vaccination certificate is that someday soon I'll be able to get on the train to Paris and we can do this in person. And I'll give you the bees on both cheeks because that's when we'll be through this.
I'll drink to that. Many thanks, Dave, for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Borzu Daragahi for being with us from Istanbul, George Kazolias, Leela Jacinto. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.